On va passer à la deuxième intervention. On va passer à l'anglais, surtout, avec une intervention de Moritz von Brescius, qui est un spécialiste d'histoire globale des sciences et des savoirs, qui a rédigé sa thèse, pour reprendre une formule d'hier après-midi, sous la direction de quelqu'un qui est dans la salle, mais je ne vais pas pointer quelqu'un du doigt, qui a été publié l'an dernier, non, il y a 2 ans déjà, German Science in the Time of Empire. Et si j'ai bien compris, qui a aussi fait l'objet d'une exposition à Munich, au Alpenverein, il y a, c'était en amont, et exposition qui a donné lieu à une publication chez BULAC. Actuellement, Moritz est boursier à Harvard. Parallèlement à ça, il dirige aussi un projet ambitionné à l'université de Berne dans un grand projet sur l'histoire des déchets et des ressources, si j'ai bien compris, comme objet historique, passionnant. Et dernière corde à son arc, il travaille également à son habilitation sur la question du temps et de la temporalité dans l'histoire de l'extraction, autour d'un personnage qui s'appelle Gustav Mann, dont je crois il va être question maintenant. Merci.
Merci beaucoup et bienvenue dans ce que l'on appelle en anglais the siesta session, après le déjeuner. Je parle un tout petit peu français, mais je pensais que ce serait plus clair si je présentais en anglais. Donc, good afternoon. I'm very grateful for the kind invitation to talk about my current research in front of such an esteemed audience today. In the next 20 minutes, I want to explore the role of scientific travel in the context of my current book project on rubber. My study traces the very beginnings of the plantation revolution of this key industrial commodity. To address the concerns of this conference head-on, I probe in particular the impact of travels and the knowledges they generated on the political economy of rubber within the British Empire. In the 1870s, British imperial officials and foresters pioneered the transformation of rubber from a tree tapped in the wild into a systematically harvested plantation crop. My paper provides a fresh understanding of how that plantation revolution came about. It challenges deeply entrenched views by offering a new geography and chronology of rubber's transformation into an object of what was called artificial cultivation under the protective umbrella of empire. Tropical rubber lay at the heart of many communication and transport technologies of the last 2 centuries and was thus essential to the making of the modern world. Just think of the telegraph, the steamship, railways, cars, and airplanes, all technologies dependent on rubber in one way or another. From the 1840s onwards, rubber became a chemically modified material with 1,001 uses, including in the fields of leisure, medicine, the electric industries, science, and warfare. You see some traveling articles from the 1850s and also floating rubber bridges in the late 1840s that kind of allowed quicker movement during military campaigns. In the tropics, rubber quickly became an indispensable instrument of colonization. An ever-expanding array of rubber-based gear helped travelers and armies penetrate the wet and inhospitable climates of equatorial regions. Received wisdom has it that rubber only assumed such essential importance in the context of mechanized warfare in the 20th century and the 2 world wars. Yet contemporaries from the 1850s onwards were already reflecting on the growing reliance of Western manufacturers and consumers, which included states and their armies, on goods and appliances produced with this so-called singular substance. No other industrial material combined rubber's unique properties of impermeability and elasticity under both hot and cold conditions. What is more, rubber could only be sourced from the tropics, a dependence that would prove problematic once Western producers could no longer secure infinite supplies of it from equatorial regions. So I now turn to examine how a discourse of a possible rubber scarcity in the future was taking shape in the late 1860s that ultimately led to diverging initiatives to turn wild rubber trees into a plantation crop. The idea to acclimate the Brazilian rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis, within British territories in Asia had first emerged in the late 18th century and was reissued in the 1850s. This would make industrial Britain less dependent on the volatilities of the world market for rubber, which in the mid-19th century mostly came from the Amazon region. To overcome this potential kind of supply bottleneck and to counter price fluctuations, various botanists and imperial servants in British India teamed up with London investors to search for alternative sources of rubber in the Indian subcontinent. By the mid-19th century, over a dozen different rubber-yielding species had been discovered by European naturalists, each giving a unique latex of varying quality and quantity. Assamese rubber tracts had been discovered as early as the 1810s. By the late 1830s, botanists Nathaniel Wallach and John Forbes Royal were pondering how Britain's extensive possessions in the East could yield abundant supplies. Since Wallach noted that, I quote, rubber is coming into immense consumption and that a new application turns up almost every day, it seemed like the right moment for the British East India Company territories, in Royal's words, to now also plant the noble, laurel-looking, milk-secreting, fortune-making Ficus elastica, a rubber tree indigenous to South and Southeast Asia. Mostly known today as an interior decorative plant, the Ficus elastica tree actually grows to majestic proportions in the wild. Here you see it in the wild. As far as the supposedly unlimited supplies of Ficus elastica rubber from Assam were concerned, a dramatic shift in perception took place between the 1830s and late 1860s. While earlier company reports and projections had stressed the boundless reserves, the conversation changed after 1869. I want to argue that this market shift in perception, from superabundance to the alarming prospect of shortages, and indeed the emergence of a whole new discourse on future rubber scarcity, resulted from a series of insights gained from imperial travels and surveys in the Northeast Indian borderlands. These expeditionary insights became the foundation of official projections and fears, which would in turn influence imperial policies for decades. The accumulated intelligence from imperial surveys and eyewitness accounts also provided the kind of urgency and momentum to ultimately realize the old idea of domesticating rubber production directly within British colonies. New archival evidence from Indian and European repositories suggests that historians have so far overlooked two key missing links in the early history of rubber plantations. First, the crucial role of forestry surveys and local observations in convincing imperial officials of the urgent need to kind of proactively intervene in supply chains of tropical rubber. And second, the formative influence of cinchona plantations on the systematic cultivation of other strategic plants promoted by the government of India in the second half of the 19th century. Enter an obscure, now largely forgotten bioprospector and scientific forester named Gustav Mann. Mann had initially trained at Kew Gardens near London as a horticulturalist. In 1859, he was sent to West Africa as a plant hunter in the service of Kew Gardens, the Foreign Office, and the Royal Navy. Above all, Mann became concerned with the seemingly dwindling supplies of palm oil and timber reserves in the Gulf of Guinea. For this looming crisis, he blamed the purportedly unchecked pillaging of natural resources by African producers and merchants. How much better the West African palm oil industry would fare, he suggested, if only the British would establish direct control over the source regions and modes of production. This was part of his personal learning curve on how to think about finite natural commodities, protective countermeasures against the spectre of exhaustion, and the role of the state in securing permanent supplies of vital cash crops. Mann's observations and collections of formerly unknown West African plants earned him praise from fellow naturalists, including a reference in Darwin's Origin of Species, as well as a paid position on a recently established cinchona plantation in Darjeeling in northeast India in 1864. Mann thus became a cog in a well-oiled imperial machine responsible for acclimating numerous useful crops across the various climatic zones of the Indian subcontinent. Stolen cinchona trees from the Andean republics, now grown in India, were supposed to make the British Empire independent from foreign and thus unreliable supplies of quinine. This, to be sure, was the most important anti-malarial febrifuge of the 19th century. Quinine possessed huge strategic importance, not least for the European colonization of Africa. Excessive extraction of the valued bark of cinchona trees threatened future supplies of a commodity that seemed again to be falling victim to unchecked plunder by native collectors and South American statesmen. Gustav Mann worked on the cinchona plantations in Darjeeling only a few years before climbing up the ladder of the Raj's scientific forestry departments. He soon assumed responsibilities for Sikkim and then Assam as assistant conservator of forests. But he never forgot the logistical, institutional, and ideological tools and justifications that had been instrumental in integrating cinchona production in the imperial political economy. In fact, I argue that the domestication of quinine production in British India to secure permanent supply chains would serve Mann as a kind of direct blueprint when he helped initiate the plantation revolution for rubber from the margins of empire in High Asia. Despite the significant cross-fertilization of official plantation schemes, the expanding cultivations of quinine and rubber in British India have never been linked. But such transformative connectivities reveal new insights into how various commodity frontiers became entangled through the mobility of actors and the transfer of experience and expertise. Among Gustav Mann's first activities in Assam was the careful study of the current state of its forests. And here you see the first large-scale kind of rubber tree map of the frontier region that he produced. In his influential and widely quoted so-called Progress Report of Forest Administration in Bengal for the year 1868-69, Mann painted a very grim picture. It stood in marked contrast to earlier optimism. Above all, he provided a detailed description of the destructive methods for extracting latex from wild rubber trees in Assam. So, in his view, a serious problem was that the European and Indian contractors who had bought the right from the imperial state to have the valuable milk extracted from rubber trees in kind of circumscribed areas had, I quote him, not the slightest control over the tapping of the trees. This, he noted, quote again, encouraged them to obtain the largest possible quantity during the shortest possible time, without any regard, however, for future supplies. Mann's report described in graphic detail the most outrageous wholesale destruction of these valuable trees, evoking the image of an ecological massacre. He vividly described how several hundred magnificent trees lay in all directions on the ground after the despicable attacks. Like mutilated corpses, the majestic plants had cuts across their trunks and roots by which all that they could yield was extracted immediately. Initially, not all officials accepted his drastic eyewitness accounts. But despite such doubts, and even though other British and European travelers to East and West Africa, the Amazon and South Asian rubber tracts had warned of the destructive practices of many indigenous rubber collectors, Gustav Mann's report from 1869, based on his numerous inspection trips into the jungles of Assam, was the signal that cut through the noise. His was not a solitary voice in the wilderness. On the contrary, his reports from northeast India gripped the attention of everyone in the circle of influential government agents and projectors who would later become responsible for the organization of the transfer of the Hevea brasiliensis tree from Brazil to Asia after 1876. Besides Joseph Hooker, SQ director, these were the chemist James Collins in London, the traveler and merchant Henry A. Wickham, and the influential traveler, writer, and later Royal Geographical Society president Clements Markham, who advanced the kind of scheme of Hevea transplantations in theory and action. All of them copied entire passages from Gustav Mann's forestry report into their own writings, often without acknowledgement. Mann's authority derived from the fact that he was the first senior official to witness and capture the ongoing destruction in these jungles. Yet he also openly acknowledged how he enlisted numerous indigenous tappers as valuable informants and witnesses of the spiral of destruction. So there was, in other words, a great ambiguity in Mann's relation to kind of tribal peoples. They were kind of condemned as supposedly wasteful collectors, but they were also kind of considered and acknowledged as a rich kind of source of planting knowledge of the Assam rubber tree, all at the same time. Through Gustav Mann's correspondence with Joseph Hooker in London, we can also see how he sought to build up a more kind of global picture of the threatening rubber crisis that he was witnessing on the spot. Indeed, to make informed decisions on policy proposals, Mann collected and inquired about travelers' testimonies and official reportage from other equatorial regions of the world. For instance, in October 1870, he asked for information directly from Hooker at Kew Gardens, then a key center of economic botany and ecological intelligence. I quote, here you see kind of the influential people involved. And here you see the rubber tract. Anyway, do you know if the caoutchouc trees of Mexico or in Brazil are likely to get exhausted or not? Or could you tell me how I could find this out? It is a forest question of some importance for my division, he wrote in 1870. Mann repeated his warning that the wild stocks of Ficus elastica in Assam can certainly not stand regular tapping unless it is done very carefully and not left to the natives only, end quote. Extrapolating from his local observations in India to reveal a growing global understanding of the problem and its implications, he continued, quote, as I suspected to be much the same in America, I think an effort should be made to secure a permanent supply of the rubber from here. What he was calling for was direct government intervention in the industry in the form of rubber estates to be established under the authority and scientific expertise of foresters like himself. Most origin stories carry, of course, an element of speculation and subjective interpretation. Yet in a series of official correspondence between Kolkata, Assam, and London that ended with the creation of the first large rubber plantation in the British Empire, numerous officials and botanists made repeated reference to Gustav Mann's 1869 report as the kind of foundational text for subsequent debates. Mann was ultimately entrusted with establishing this first rubber plantation at Chadwa, north of the Brahmaputra River, in 1873. So here, various kinds of knowledges intersected. Indigenous horticultural knowledge regarding the Assamese rubber tree, Mann's forestry expertise and his wide-ranging travels through that borderland region, but also the commercial experiences of European rubber merchants already active at the frenzied rubber frontier. After initial planting failures at Chadwa, the government field relied on the procurement of several hundred rubber seeds from nearby tribal communities to keep plantation operations going. The officials' dependence on local, non-European supply chains of seeds and knowledge is notable, as it decenters the view of the Chadwa enterprise as resulting purely from imperial ingenuity, agency, and material networks. I want to leave you with the following thought on the political and economic impact of travel. Gustav Mann's gripping accounts, letters, and petitions urging the imperial government to intervene in a growing crisis of over-extraction not only led to the pioneering rubber field at Chadwa. They also triggered chains of events beyond his personal control. Due to the ambitions of other colonial servants and botanists that he had inspired and kind of summoned into action, British institutions and imperial agents pursued multiple other rubber plantation schemes. These crucially included the ultimately successful acquisition of 70,000 Hevea rubber seeds from Brazil by Henry Wickham in 1876. This infamous act of supposed biopiracy led to the plant's domestication in various British, Dutch, and French colonies in the East by the early 20th century. Far more than Gustav Mann's government-run rubber estate of Ficus elastica in Assam, Hivea's domestication in Asia lay at the heart of rubber's plantation revolution. This, above all, is what transformed the global geography of this vital commodity, with effects that are still felt to this day. These missing links in the history of rubber were thus vital. Gustav Mann's dire warnings of a looming rubber crisis, which provoked the British Empire to intervene in global supply patterns, as well as the kind of ideological and praxeological cross-fertilization of plantation economies in British India, of cinchona and then rubber trees. Their cultivation, I have argued, stemmed from the same quest for resource domestication and even relied partly on the same practitioners. Gustav Mann's travels and the uptake of his reports in government circles also matter in another way. They demonstrate how plant transfers and economic enterprises that were ultimately coordinated from Kew arose from the margins of the expanding global capitalist system, in this case, from itinerant observations and conclusions drawn in barely accessible frontier regions in Assam, where a rubber craze had started in the 1860s. My analysis thus tries to correct earlier, somewhat theological narratives of Britain's global rubber industry that kind of too narrowly described transformative visions and initiatives to the imperial metropole, symbolized by Kew Gardens. Let me give you a sense, and with this I close, of the ground-shifting effects of that imperial acclimation project of Hevea. In the mid-19th century, Britain had to import virtually all its natural rubber supplies for its home industries from countries beyond its direct political control, in particular Brazil. By the end of the First World War, most natural rubber on the world market was produced in British-controlled overseas territories. Besides the growing output of indigenous smallholders, the main sources were now European plantation economies in Sumatra and Malaya, and to a lesser extent in Ceylon, India, Burma, and other British colonies. The effects were striking, as you can see here in the numbers. In 1900, of the 60,000 tons of rubber produced in the world, only 3 tons originated in Asia. In 1919, by contrast, of the more than 450,000 tons produced, over 420,000 came from the East Indies, mostly from British and Dutch Hevea rubber plantations. Few other commodities in world history showed kind of such extraordinary quantitative growth in so short a time. This was obviously not a one-man revolution, of course. It relied on the coordinated efforts and support of various imperial naturalists, state servants, botanic gardens, shipping lines, Wardian cases, experimental fields, and agronomic and chemical expertise developed in Britain and overseas. Nonetheless, the story of how the first rubber plantations in the British Empire came about highlights the importance of travelers' testimonies, their political recognition, and the imperial enterprises such itinerant science schemes could help to initiate. Today, we are still living with their ongoing, often disruptive consequences for human societies and natural environments in the global south. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Moritz. On peut te poser des questions en français?
Oui.
Ça va, très bien. OK, aussi pour la salle. C'est un peu intriguant, l'histoire que tu nous racontes, parce qu'on se rend compte que des grandes inquiétudes sur l'extractivisme et la surexploitation ne datent pas d'il y a 30 ans, mais qu'on se posait déjà ces questions-là il y a très très longtemps, sans aucune conséquence, ce qui pourrait être un mauvais signe pour certains débats actuels. Ce que je trouvais très intéressant aussi, c'est l'intérêt ou la crainte ou la compassion pour le salut des arbres de la part de Gustav Mann, à un moment où d'autres rapports vis-à-vis des populations autochtones pourraient susciter des commentaires du même genre, mais qu'on ne retrouve que très très rarement. Je me demandais si c'était ce genre de commentaires sur l'inquiétude face à la destruction des arbres ou de la nature, quelque chose de très très courant dans ce dossier.
Yeah, thank you. If it's okay, I will answer in English. But yeah, I think kind of the motivation for this project also stems from the fact that I think we've been talking a lot about supply chains in the present, the kind of shortages of materials, the disruptions that the lack of certain materials kind of bring about. And of course, this has a very long history. And the interesting thing today, when we look at kind of rare earth, for instance, this was not a vital strategic commodity 100 years ago, and suddenly it became one. And the same is true for rubber. It had been around for centuries, but it only became a very strategic material from the 1840s onwards, once it had become kind of chemically modified and could be put to use to like 1,000 different uses. And therefore, I think it's an interesting kind of a similar trajectory, that it was a very recent but increasingly important strategic material that I think provides a very interesting chronology. Yeah, I'll leave it
there. Simon.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful and very important. You've surely demonstrated the bankruptcy of the hagiographic histories that rubber has normally been given, both by economic historians and by imperial historians. So I wonder if you could say just a little more about the implications of what you're doing with the Mann case for models of travel, since two things seem very striking here. Mann is a professional traveler. He's an inspector on behalf of the Raj. He does not go out and come back to the metropole. He is always, in a certain sense, already between Kolkata and Assam, which is a huge distance, but from London, not a huge distance. So two issues strike one: his credibility and his difference. Credibility on the one hand, he's an inspector. They are paid to be credible. But that credibility, it's been very well demonstrated by Chris Bailey and many others, always depended on the ability of the inspector to reinforce the prejudices of the administration. There's an exact correlation between an inspection that is believable and an inspection that confirms the views of the center. Mann challenges, we saw right at the start, the views of the center, and many find him credible. From the point of view of the history of the learned voyage, that's extremely interesting. And I'm sure you have a lot to tell us about that.
How much time do I have? So thank you very much. What is interesting is to look at his kind of changing roles within the British kind of empire. He's really sent as this kind of subordinate plant collector to West African expedition, Bakey's expedition actually, that was bereft of its own naturalist because of the death of the other naturalist already employed. He never joined the expedition of Bakey in 1859, but then decided to kind of just roam around and collect. And to the surprise of many, he sends marvelous collections that Hooker and Charles Darwin and others were very excited about. And this was his way to kind of favor patronage and support from various different people in the metropole. He had a very big standing there, but it was still as a kind of subordinate instrumental plant collector and prospector. And once he goes to India, he assumes higher responsibilities. He suddenly leads the cinchona plantation. He tries to cultivate cinchona at various elevations, tries with different cinchona species, and becomes more than just a prospector and inspector, but becomes actually a kind of practicing economic botanist, and then also forest expert. He learns about the tradition of German scientific forestry only after coming to British India, which is interesting in itself. But then becomes also an expert. He goes back to study the newest practices in central Germany, the Harz regions, and then goes back with these new insights to teach a new generation of Indian foresters with that. So he's really kind of assuming more and more prestigious positions, ending up leading his forestry department in Assam for 16 years, even though that was not without controversy. But I think you are absolutely right that he is an interesting figure because he challenged certain kind of perceived wisdoms. At the same time, he condemned the kind of rubber extraction by tribal communities in the region where he was stationed. And at the same time, he's very open in acknowledging his own reliance on them as informants and as actually very kind of experienced growers and cultivators of the Ficus elastica rubber tree, not as a source of an export commodity that would be sold on the world markets, but rather as a beautiful shade giver, a tree with very kind of high aesthetic appeals, and also one that was considered a holy grove by some. So there's a very interesting kind of polyvalence about this particular rubber tree right there. And I think his case is also interesting because it shows us that Kew was only one center within the British Empire where certain kind of discussions took place on how to kind of turn wild species into systematically cultivated cash crops. And I think Calcutta, the gardens there, assume more and more importance. Also because this was the first rubber plantation in the British Empire, and therefore it was of huge symbolic importance. It was repeatedly visited by high imperial officials, including the viceroy, who plants a rubber tree himself there. But it's also a site that became a space for instruction and learning. So what the British Empire actually does is to say, well, these tribal communities, they are wasteful collectors, but perhaps we could kind of get them into the cash economy and make them productive members of this frontier region by teaching them directly how to become rubber planters. So different kind of members of the Lushais, a tribal community in Assam, get sent to Chadua, are trained there, go back, and the idea was to really kind of enlarge the rubber output by pretty much civilizing violent frontier tribes and turn them into kind of rubber planters, really. So that's another point that I find very interesting, the different functions and uses of Chadua over time. Including, I would add, at some point they realized the more rubber they planted, the more vulnerable these trees would become, like to pests and diseases. So suddenly this becomes a very important side of entomology and entomological kind of researches, because entire plantation departments were devastated by the attack of different fungi and pests and so on. So in short, it never pays off, the whole enterprise, but it became a very interesting living laboratory of plant capitalism.
Merci beaucoup.
Can I just add one quick thing back there?
Yes.
Because I know you've already, there's a lot to talk about with this, but I just wanted to pick up on one thing beyond what Simon has said, which is I was very aware that your story begins in a sense, about a century after both cinchona and rubber itself were discovered by Europeans through the active engagement of indigenous communities in the equatorial regions of South America. And of course, in your story, and perhaps this is just the way it happens, those communities get written out because of the tremendous scale of the production that begins in Asia. So I just think it would be, hopefully we'll have some time to discuss this in the final session, if there is a final session, where we discuss these kinds of things. But I do think it is relevant as we think about ways to bring back in an earlier period indigenous understanding, indigenous knowledge, the nature of their contribution to all of this, how almost inevitably, as we move toward the present, that role ends up getting just flattened in terms of its importance. And this is not in any way a critique of what you have just said, which is a wonderfully fascinating story, but it leaves us, I think, with this sense of all we can say is they had the idea and then they are no longer relevant because we, are moving on to tell a different kind of story. So I don't know, you may have two words to say about that.
I would love to. Thank you so much for the question. I think that is a very important one. You can only compress so much into 20 minutes, but as I kind of alluded to, when Gustav Mann then founds the rubber plantation at Chadua, he does it precisely because, the tribal peoples in that particular spot had a very long tradition of extracting rubber from trees and also using it to produce kind of water-resistant shoes and fabrics and to produce long-burning torches. And also because they knew how to procure seeds of this tree. I mean, I would really stress nobody knew anything about rubber cultivation in the early 1870s. It hadn't been done really on kind of industrial scale. But the arrogance of the foresters were that they supposed they would have to kind of reinvent the wheel entirely. They couldn't rely on indigenous kind of practices until they realized this is maybe a very useful source. And so at some point, the kind of plantation invites indigenous tappers, including from Nepal and other Indian regions, and they then observe how these kind of indigenous collectors actually tap the tree in a very different way than had been practiced on the plantation itself, and this gives them food for thought to kind of reconsider extractive practices on the plantation itself. And I think in the case of rubber, one could make a very strong argument that these large colonial enterprises were much less successful than indigenous smallholder production, which secured 50% of market shares by the Second World War, even though indigenous smallholders were always discriminated against. So like the highest yielding seeds they wouldn't get, but nonetheless they managed because they were more efficient. They didn't do kind of counterproductive things such as kind of clean weeding between the trees that just invited soil erosion, for instance, and a higher kind of vulnerability of the trees to different kinds of attacks by pests and fungi. So it's at some point, but that takes a couple of decades, they actually realize that they had kind of pursued the wrong strategies of cultivation. So there's a constant dialogue, but there's also this arrogance that sometimes blinds them to the very obvious and turns actually Chadua into a very costly but fascinating failure.